SPAMTON, also known as Spamton G. Spamton, is a character you meet during Chapter 2 of Deltarune. He appears multiple times throughout the chapter as an NPC, a shop owner, and as a mini-boss. Spamton also lands himself the job of being this chapter's secret boss, Spamton Neo. Because of this, Spamton ends up being a really unique character. Right after Deltarune Chapter 2 came out and took the internet by storm, Spamton quickly became insanely popular because of his witty dialogue and personality. On top of this, Spamton tends to use a currency known as Chromer. Nobody really knows what Chromer is, but Spamton sure does love it. This has led to a bunch of memes basically surrounding either Spamton or Chromer, so I thought I should do something with this wacky little dude as well. That's why I decided I should make a game that has him in it. But him being in it is not going to do him justice as he already is in Deltarune as an NPC. So how about let's make an actual game starring him? One where he is fully playable. That's what this video is about. With all that out of the way, let's jump right into making a game starring Spamton. Alright, let's get right into it. Like with any other game I make, I always draw out a design document detailing every aspect of the game. From the mechanics, to items, enemies, and more, everything I plan to do is laid out through this document, so let's go over that. First, I came up with a simple premise. The game would have you playing as Spamton, and your goal would be to collect as much Chromer as possible. Since he clearly loves Chromer, I thought that this would be a simple enough premise to create a game around. Next, I had to think of a genre for this game. I decided to stick close to Deltarune's roots and make it a bullet hell game. Not only that, but I added the collector genre as well, as your goal would be to collect as much Chromer while surviving attacks at the same time. Alongside this, you'd get Chromer for beating enemies, so there'd be an incentive to killing them. I wanted this game to feel like an arcade game, where your main goal is just to get as high of a score as possible. Next, I designed how the player slash Spamton would play out. You'd be able to control him using the arrow keys, and the spacebar would be utilized for shooting. Specifically, Spamton would shoot upwards only. Alongside this, I decided to give him 5 HP, as I felt that was fair enough for a bullet hell-like game. You could also be healed by a specific item. I specifically jotted down press F1 Easter egg. In Deltarune, one of the tips Spamton gives the player is quite literally press F1 for help. If you press this on your keyboard, a little Spamton-like creature shows up and heals the player. I thought this was perfect. If you press F1 in-game, you can be healed once. Otherwise, these characters would just have a random chance to spawn. Next, I had to come up with obstacles and items for the player. Firstly, I decided on 2 projectile attacks. The first one would be a downward moving yellow soul, as when you fight Spamton Neo, the player's soul is yellow. The second projectile is the Rude Buster. This would come diagonally across from the top corners. Next up, I decided on some other obstacles that would be in the game. These included Birdley's statue and Toby in his car. Birdley's statue would slowly come down from the top, and it would have a lot of HP. Toby would come in from either side of the screen and commit vehicular manslaughter. After this, I decided on including Jevil in this game. He would basically show up, do a lot of teleporting, and shoot either Chromer or a club at you. Next, I came up with how the Chromer would naturally spawn. The first movement for the Chromer would be passive, meaning it would consistently generate at the top of the screen, and move downwards. The other movement would be a homing one. When you kill an enemy, a bunch of Chromer would fly out, then home in towards the player. After all of this, I drew up a really rough gameplay sketch. This is usually just to help me visualize what the game would look like. Everything I just mentioned is shown in this sketch, plus a couple of added elements like where the UI would be. Alongside the sketch, I jotted down a few more things, specifically that the attacks are random, Spamton shoots small blue heads, the background will be the same as the Deltarune one, and the explosion in-game would be the same realistic one used in Deltarune. So with that, I was confident enough with this plan, so I decided I should move on to actually making the game. Now comes probably the best and most rewarding part, making the game. The first thing I did was work on Spamton's movement. Within a few minutes, I had a build looking like this. You could control the player and shoot upwards. However, this was far from being complete, which I'm sure you could tell with my amazing art. So I headed on over to the Spriters resource, downloaded a bunch of sprites from Deltarune, and started to work using those. The first ones I imported were of SPAMTON and his blue head projectile, and here's what that looked like. The game was already looking miles better. Thanks, Temmie. After this, I worked on recreating the Deltarune battle background, and for fun, I added a bit of perspective to it to give it some depth. Alongside this, I created both the Chromer object and the Chromer counter. The counter would be displayed at the bottom left of the screen, and Chromer would naturally spawn from the top. Next, I worked on creating all of the enemies. The first enemy I made was Toby. As mentioned before, he would simply move from one side of the screen to the other at a fast speed. With this, I also added the super cool realistic explosion, plus the homing Chromer. Here's a build where I slowed him down to show off all of the mechanics. Basically, upon exploding Toby, a bunch of Chromer would fly out and home in towards the player. Now you can take revenge on Toby for his wacky roadkill from Deltarune. Next up, I decided to work on the Birdly statue. It was really simple, as the statue would just rotate and slowly move towards the bottom of the screen. Once defeated, like Toby, it would explode. After this, I worked on creating arguably Chapter 1 SPAMTON, Jevil. Jevil, as mentioned before, would teleport himself around the sides of the screen and have a 50% chance of shooting Chromer and a 50% chance of shooting a club. Here's what that looked like in action. I was really happy with this as I replicated the teleportation effect really well, as it's not just a pre-made animation, but rather something being made on the fly. After creating the main enemies, I worked on creating the projectiles from earlier, being the Rude Buster and Yellow Soul. These were really easy to create. The Yellow Soul would occasionally be created at the top of the screen, and it could be destroyed as well. The Rude Buster would come in from either corner of the screen and can't be destroyed. Alongside this, I created some quick UI for displaying the health. You'd have 5 bars, and once you get hit, you lose 1. Pretty self-explanatory. Next, I worked on creating the Healer. I'm not sure if these have a proper name in Deltarune, but they resemble SPAMTON and heal the player. In this game, however, they randomly spawn on the left side of the screen and heal SPAMTON instead. I also added the ability to press F1 once per round to spawn a healer. This one would instead home in towards SPAMTON instead of just flying from one side to the other. As mentioned before, this is a nod to how during a fight with SPAMTON, if you press F1 you can get healed as well. With the healer created, I decided to work on some other things. Specifically, I created a spoiler warning screen, a main menu, and a how to play screen explaining the game's simple premise and controls. With all that out of the way, one crucial thing was missing, being music and sound. I won't go too much into detail here, but all of the sounds are reused from Deltarune itself. Though I will say that the main battle theme is of course Big Shot, as that song is absolutely bopping. After all of this, the game was complete. The game turned out exactly how I wanted it to be, and in my opinion is really fun. With that, I worked on getting the itch.io page up and HTML implementation alongside it, meaning you can play this game in your browser as well. However, the browser build is a bit scuffed, so if you plan on playing the game, please download the executable on the page. There's of course a link in the description which takes you directly here. Go check it out and let me know what your high score is. If you enjoyed this video as well, be sure to give it a like, and subscribe if you are a big shot just like SPAMTON. I'll be making more wacky games like these in the future, so stick around if you're into that. As always, thanks for watching everyone, and I'll see you in the next one.